Welcome everyone. We're going to be in Genesis chapters 18 to 20 today, and we got a good bit to cover. First, we're going to go ahead and start off with a short little summary. So we started off basically Genesis chapter 1, 6 days of creation, Genesis chapter 2, seventh day of rest, as well as the specific creation of male and female. We just get a lot more detail on what happened there. Chapter 3, you had the fall of man. Chapter 4, Cain and Abel, as well as more descendants, longer genealogies, more people, but also an increasing corruption in mankind as well. So that is when we had Noah come into the scene, who got favor with the Lord, and he was tasked to build an ark and, get his family on board as well as some of the animals. And we had the great flood wiping out all those wicked people. And after that, chapter 8, the flood is starting to subside. Chapter 9, you have the covenant of the rainbow, God promising not to ever destroy the world with a flood like that again. Chapter 10, you had more descendants of Noah. Chapter 11, you had the Tower of Babel, and then even more descendants of Noah, until we finally get to Abraham. And chapter 11, right at the end, last couple of verses, Terah, who was Abram's father, or Abraham, name change already happened in our study in chapter 17, so I'll just say Abraham. So Terah took Abraham, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. So they didn't really quite make it there. They went as far as Haran, and they settled there. Then after a while, Terah died in Haran. And then Abram gets this command from God. Go forth from your country, and from your relatives, and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. He gets this promise as well, in addition to this command. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. So you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. And we know from Galatians that this is referring to perhaps a little bit about Abram and his specific time period and people he interacted with along with his descendants. But we're also getting to the main fulfillment in Galatians with Christ, and how all the families of the earth will be blessed in that. So we're still talking about Abram. I'm going to be switching from Abram and Abraham a while. So verse 4, Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran, going into the land of Canaan. But there's a famine after a bit when he gets there, and then he goes down to Egypt. It's no longer the land of Canaan anymore. He just went off to Egypt, and he says to Sarai, his wife, "See now, I know that you're a beautiful woman, so I'm worried that people want to take you and will kill me to take you. So just say that you're my sister instead." And this is going to be a pattern. We're going to actually read another instance where this pretty much the same thing kind of happens in chapters 18 to 20, namely chapter 20. But we'll get to that reading later. But this is the first time that this happens, where Abram acts deceitfully, and Pharaoh is angry at him now, and he still goes away with a lot of possessions though, but there are consequences to his actions. So number one, we see in chapter 13 with Abram and Lot that they have so many possessions that they got from Pharaoh, even though Abram acted deceitfully toward Pharaoh and said that, well, this is just my sister. So Pharaoh took her, and nothing really happened there, thank God. But he almost lost his wife, but he still got a lot of possessions out of it. He was treated well for it, even after the deception. But those possessions now have negative consequences, because the land can't support both Abram and his nephew Lot, because they have too many possessions. So they had to split off and separate. Now Abram's been separated from one of his last kinsmen. His father had already died. He didn't bring more of his family with him, apparently, as the promise says that he should be leaving the rest of his family. So he's leaving Lot now because of their possessions being too great, and Lot is now in trouble. He gets captured by a bunch of kings coming into fight with other kings. And so Abram has to risk his life now to rescue Lot, but it's still an honorable thing that he does. And then chapter 15, Abram is promised a son. We get more specific on that promise of how Abram is going to be a father of many nations. So he's promised a son. But in chapter 16, even after that promise, we see some bad things happening because they don't rest in God's promise and they don't wait for God and in his timing. So Sarai already knows that in verse 2 of chapter 16, the Lord has prevented her from bearing children. So they know it's from the Lord, and yet they're not satisfied in waiting according to the promise that he's given them. Instead, they try to fulfill the promise by themselves in a bad way. So instead, they bring up their Egyptian maid Hagar, who was most likely the one of the male and female servants that Pharaoh gave to Abram as kind of, not really an apology, but more along the lines of treating Abram well and making sure that there's no bad blood between them, since Pharaoh was trying to take his wife, even though he didn't know that it was his wife or anything like that. But either way, Hagar most likely came from that exchange. So another major consequence of Abram acting deceitfully, they have this Egyptian maid Hagar, who Sarai gets this great idea that, okay, well, if the Lord has made me barren, how about you have relations with this Egyptian servant? And so he does, and there are consequences to that as well. Now the Egyptian maid is despising Sarai in her sight. Sarai treats her harshly until she flees, and we get this promise of, okay, well, even though, bad things have happened, God is still looking out for Hagar. He still sees and hears, basically. And he promises that Hagar will also be the mother of a multitude of descendants, and namely Ishmael. And Ishmael would be a perennial enemy to the Israelites. So there's a negative consequence to that as well. But eventually, and we won't read that right now, but later on, Hagar will be set out and sent off from Abram's household. She's told to return, though. So she's basically still with Abram until Isaac is born. Then Abram decides to send Hagar out officially. So we're getting into chapter 17 now in our summary, and then we'll start reading 18 to 20. But in chapter 17, we get another reiteration of the promise as well as the sign of the promise and covenant as well, which is circumcision. This is extremely important for the Jewish people because it's their physical sign that they are part of the covenant and of God's people. And it's supposed to be kept throughout their generations as well. We have the promise of the land in addition to all of that, along with another reiteration of you will have a son, a descendant will be born from you and from Sarai as well. So then we get into chapters 18 to 20. So if anyone wants to volunteer to read, you can go to the Bible Study React channel and react to that message there. I see Matt and Danny on there, volunteered to read. We just need 3 volunteers. If there are extra volunteers, then some of you will be answering application questions and all that good stuff. So hopefully the summary made sense. We're still talking about Abram, and in chapter 17 his name changed to Abraham. So I'll try to remember to say that instead of Abram. So we're talking about Abraham now. He's been fairly faithful to God. He's righteous in the sense that he is part of the covenant now, even though he has his own moral failings from time to time. He's still following after God. And chapter 18 now, I think I saw Matt on the reaction list first. So Matt, could you just read all of chapter 18? And while we're reading chapter 18, I want you to be looking for the identity of the 3 men. So we're going to learn about 3 men. We're not really told specifically who they are, but I want you to kind of, as we read through, kind of figure out, okay, who exactly are these three men? Whenever you're ready, Matt. I did, thank you for asking. Oh yeah, beget, yeah. Chapter 18. Alright, thank you. And good job reading, especially that last section. That kind of dialogue isn't the easiest thing to read. Alright, so I asked you guys a question before we started reading on the identity of the three men who came to Abraham. Who do you think these three people are? Okay, Enley says 2 angels and Jesus. Was that what you're going to say, Matt? Okay, so Danny suggests perhaps the 3 wise men. Do you mean like an A group of 3 wise men, or the same 3 wise men that visited Jesus in the New Testament? Christophany. Yeah, so if we do look at the text, we don't see all the way as specifically as a Christophany, but we could certainly go that way. But we do see in the text, in verse 13, right there, we see, and the Lord said to Abram, or Abraham, rather. And the Hebrew word there, of course, is Yahweh. As we're looking at it, you can see most translations kind of put it in all caps, kind of the small caps kind of thing. That's when we're referring to Yahweh, not just any Lord or any possible Lord. We're just talking about Yahweh specifically. And the Lord said to Abraham, verse 14, is anything too difficult for the Lord? Verse 17, the Lord said. Verse 19, the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him. And the Lord is still talking, and we see that designation all the other times there. And we're also seeing that 3 people came up to him. One of them is the Lord who's speaking to Abraham, and the 2 other people, as Matt already spoiled for us, the 2 other people are angels, as we learn in the first verse of chapter 19. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom, so the Lord is not with them anymore as they're traveling. So the Lord and Abraham kind of stay back a little bit while the 2 angels continue on. And Abraham also calls him, when he is talking, especially about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 25, far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you. And here's the designation that Abraham gives to this person. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? So we're told that this person is the Lord. We're also told that this person is the judge of all the earth, which, angels are not the judge of all the earth. So we have those 2 main designations there to show us that we're talking more than just an angel for this 3rd person. That's an interesting idea, Danny. I don't think we can really say that. We're told that the other 2 people are angels, though that word can simply mean messenger as well. So it's a little broader than specifically an angelic being. It's a possibility, but I don't think we have enough information to go with that. But we do have enough information to say for certain that at least one of these people is the Lord, as we're told in the text here, and as we're told by Abraham as well. So I also want you just to imagine a little bit, as we read through this narrative, the first section there, when these 3 people first meet Abraham, and he says, my Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, please do not pass your servant by. Little water be brought to wash yourselves, and I'll bring a piece of bread as well, that you may refresh yourself. And since you have visited your servant, so they said, do as you have said. And then after that, Abraham just starts hurrying. He hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quickly, prepare 3 measures of fine flour, knead it, and make bread cakes. So he's not just walking around, he's hurrying from place to place. And in verse 7, we see the verb ran. So imagine a 99-year-old man who has been circumcised just in the last chapter. We don't know how many days it was after his circumcision, but we do know that he was about 100 years old when he begot Isaac. So he's still very close. A 99-year-old man from chapter 17 who's been circumcised, he's now running to the herd because, the people who have visited him are so significant and important. He's running, he's telling the servant to hurriedly prepare a calf, and he's taking curds and milk, and he's doing all this stuff, even though he just said he'd just bring them a piece of bread at the beginning. He's preparing them a whole feast, basically. And now he's standing by them under the tree as they ate. So he's doing as much as he can. And we also see the same kind of theme with Lot as well, upon meeting the 2 angels. We don't really see Lot running around as much, but Abraham, he's just running full steam. He's doing all this stuff that he can. And then we get into an interesting little section where they ask, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And there, in the tent, he says. So then they're telling him about the promise. By this time next year, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And she's kind of listening in, and then she laughs. And apparently, she doesn't think that they can hear them, or perhaps they have supernatural knowledge of her action. But either way, she's laughing, and they point it out to her. I just want to bring up a similar passage in verse 17 of chapter 17, very previous chapter. "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, 'Will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?'" So my question is, why is it pointed out to Sarah that she laughed? And it looks like she's being rebuked as well. But Abraham, when he laughed in chapter 17, it was not pointed out to him. Why do you think that is? Is there a reason for that? Yeah, that's a good point. I couched it in an assumption when I asked the question. We don't know if it was a rebuke exactly. So it was good that you pointed out. So yeah, it's just one of those things, right? Perhaps Abraham, when he laughed, it was more out of joy than out of mockery. Perhaps when Sarah laughed, it was more out of mockery and unbelief. Or perhaps it just wasn't a rebuke at all, and the Lord and the angels knew that she would deny laughing, and so that's why they asked her. Perhaps it was out of unbelief, though, and they wanted to, point that out by saying, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" Just to, help them see a little more, even though there might be a little bit in, disbelief, just to show them that the promise will be fulfilled and to ensure that it will be fulfilled. Encourage them of that. A couple options. It's not a big deal, though, but just something interesting that you can think about. Any other questions that you guys had on this chapter? Go ahead. Take your time. I think Matt unmuted too. Maybe you could ask first. Yeah. I think it's a very important question, because sometimes when we think of righteousness, especially after the New Testament, we think, okay, we're thinking righteous as either someone who is perfectly sinless, or we're talking about someone who has Christ's imputed righteousness on them, where Christ and God has declared this person is righteous based on Christ's own righteousness that he has appropriated by faith that God has given them. And that's kind of what we think about righteousness. Obviously, we know that Abraham is not perfectly sinless, and it also becomes interesting when Christ has not, gotten there at that point in time yet. And you could say, keeping in line with the New Testament, trying to maybe, I would say, insert those truths back into this time period, you might say that, well, God passed over previously committed sins with Abraham and everything like that, but Abraham believed in it, was credited to him as righteousness. Perhaps we're still talking about Christ's righteousness. I don't think we can really go quite that far yet exactly, but rather, I think when we're talking about righteousness in Genesis, I'll just read from the commentary here. Abraham seems to be using the language of faith, the faith. In 15:6, righteousness was imparted to him because of his faith. Righteous then became a description of those who were members of the covenant of faith and who were seeking to please the Lord. It is on this basis that the New Testament can call Lot, Abraham's nephew, righteous in 2 Peter 2:7. He was a believer, but his life did not always show it. So instead of talking about the righteousness that we're familiar with in the New Testament in the context of Genesis and the covenant people, we're actually just talking about someone who is part of that covenant. So hopefully that answers the question. And I'll give you guys the screenshot of the commentary too, with the highlighted part, just in case you want to read through it again. So I think Danny had a question too. Yeah, verse 18. Yeah. Yeah. It's certainly possible. We're not really told specifically that it is, but I think that we can lean on that because he does ask, is anything too difficult for the Lord? So it does seem to be a little bit of a rebuke, or a little bit of a correction, perhaps. Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question. Yeah. Hospitality. Yeah, it's a possibility. Possibly angels more likely, as when we talk about God after the New Testament, we know Christ seated at the right hand of God and the Father enthroned in heaven, Holy Spirit indwelling. But it's a possibility. And for angels, I think it's more of a possibility especially. But yeah, these verses, these chapters in Genesis, specifically 18 and 19 with Lot being hospitable to the angels as well, they're often used as examples of Hebrews 13:2. And they've also been used as examples by the Jews even before Hebrews was written as well, to show hospitality because you may be entertaining an angel unawares. So yeah, it's an interesting passage, and I think there's a little bit of application with that too. And there's also, I think, application especially with how Abraham was acting and treating these people. He knew that they were special, though. I mean, I think we can get to that part at least. He knew that they were special, not just regular old people at the beginning. And as time went on, I think that he started realizing that, yes, the person in front of him is the Lord, the judge of all the earth. But even before that, you can see him running around, doing his best to be hospitable to these people. It does seem like he knew that they were special right off the bat. And we'll get into chapter 19 now, just because we have to move on. Even though chapter 18 is really good, we'll get into chapter 19 now, which is, a heavy chapter, if you're familiar with it. So we got Danny on the list next. So, Danny, could you read all of chapter 19? Yeah, just keep going. I know that was a pretty heavy chapter, but thank you for reading all of that. That was good. I think we might be able to finish one more chapter after this one, but chapter 19 with Sodom and Gomorrah is a very heavy chapter. So we have the two angels traveling on. We don't see the Lord with them. We just see the two angels. They reach Sodom and they meet Lot, who is apparently right at the gate. And the idea in the ancient cultures, especially in Israel and places like that, we see that if you were at the gate, just kind of sitting there and being there, it was suspected that you were most likely maybe some kind of elder or judge or had some kind of position of authority in the city, that you would be at the gate and welcoming travelers and kind of getting them situated perhaps and things like that. And it's a central location kind of as well, at least a location of a landmark where people had issues, they could bring them to, you sitting at the gate. So perhaps Lot has some kind of position of authority like that. Of course, when we do see later on, they decry this alien who's come in as a judge against them. But perhaps he has some kind of position in the city, and that's why he's sitting at the gate. But he does apparently recognize them as special because he bows with his face to the ground, and he offers them hospitality in his house. And they say, well, we'll just stay in the square. But apparently Lot knows just how bad the people of the city are. So he instead encourages them, urged them strongly, as verse 3 says, to go into his house so he could, keep them safe. And then all of the people from the entire town start going up to his house and start yelling at him, calling out to him, banging on the door, things like that. Where the men who came to you tonight, bring them out to us so that we may have relations with them. The NLT is more explicit, so that we may have sex with them, which definitely gets at what the text actually means there. That's what they would like to do with those new people who have just joined and just entered the town. And so Lot, he goes outside and he closes the door behind him. And that is a very gutsy move, I would say, when you have an entire town, and Sodom was a big place, we have an entire town of people, of able-bodied men coming at you, wanting something from you to the point where they would be willing to rape the newcomers. It's a very gutsy move that Lot is doing there. And there would really be no way out of this when you have all of those people against you. There's no way out of this unless by divine intervention, as we'll see later on. But he says, don't act wickedly, and then even after his gutsy move, he offers his 2 daughters, which was a terrible move. They say, stand aside. This one came in as an alien, and already he's acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than the newcomers. So they realize that they are going to treat those newcomers badly. And they pressed so hard against Lot that they came near to breaking the door. So he's right outside the door. They're pushing against him with so much force that they almost break the door. And so the angels rescued him. They blinded the people out there. And they say, do you have anyone with you? And we're coming to bring you out of this place. So if we remember Abraham's pleas in the very previous chapter, where he pleads with God and asks him, well, you won't destroy a city on account of some righteous people, right? And he brings the number down to 10 righteous people. So apparently there were 10 at most righteous people in the city before God destroyed it. My question is, how many righteous people perhaps were in the city when God destroyed it? Yeah, I liked how you were also careful as well. Dogman especially, we know that there must have been less than 10. But we could also go a little further, perhaps, and say that, well, maybe God brought out all of the righteous people. And we know that that was namely Lot. So he brought Lot out, even though he didn't need to. He could have just destroyed Lot along with everyone else, because that would probably be less than 10 righteous people in the city. But God went, above and beyond in his mercy, and he brought Lot out of there. And, verse 16, for instance, but he hesitated when they told Lot to get out. So the men seized his hand and the hand of his wife and the hand of his 2 daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him. And they brought him out and put him outside the city. So perhaps there were none righteous people left, and God went above and beyond the minimal promise he made to Abraham for just the 10 people. So it's also possible, yeah, the Dogman asks, is it possible just Lot and his family was saved for his sake? Yeah, certainly possible. We do know from the New Testament, 2 Peter, that Lot was righteous though. So we do know that at least. But also his family, we do know that his wife, well, we don't really know if she was righteous or not, part of the covenant promise or anything like that. But, perhaps on account of Lot, perhaps on account of Abraham, God brought his family out of there as well. So yeah, certainly possible. I also want to note the particular verb used when Lot's wife looked back. So that particular verb in chapter 19, verse 26, but his wife, from behind him, looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Our commentary notes that the verb for looking here indicates a prolonged, intense gazing at the world she had grown to love. So it's this longing stare back. It's not just she kind of glanced back at her and, heard a big sound behind me. I'll just glance back a little bit and turn into a pillar of salt. That's not what the verb means. It means that she stood there longingly gazing at the life that she had once known in that cushy town of Sodom, perhaps. So that's more what it means. Dogman, that's a good one. So we see in chapter 18 how Abraham treated well the Lord, and his angels did everything he could for them, even though it was very meager. He tried to do as much as he could, and he also pleaded with the Lord very humbly as well. Great things that we can be doing as well, and treating the Lord with that respect and reverence that he deserves. Abraham running around all over the place trying to prepare things for the Lord. Chapter 19, we see on the negative side of things, when God told them not to look back, same verb, don't longingly stare back behind you. They didn't, at least the wife didn't obey. And I think that's another good potential for application for us. When God tells us to do something, we should be obeying what God says and not looking back on perhaps our previous life and all of the wicked things that we once were involved in and our earthly desires and earthly possessions. But we should be looking forward to the place where God has told us to go, the place he's prepared for us. And then after that, Lot goes up to Zoar as he requested, because that's where he wanted to go. But then he changes his mind after a time and says, well, Zoar is not safe either. So he goes to the mountains like the angels had suggested to him in the first place. Go out in the mountains. Lot says, I think Zoar is a better place. I won't survive in the mountains. Then after a while, I think I'll go to the mountains now. All the way from the beginning where the angels suggested he go to. And yeah, that's a great verse too for application and great cross-reference as well. No one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. Very great verse. And then we see consequences, and namely some bad things happening. We already see Abraham being mentioned in the previous verse just to show just how crazy this destruction is. Abraham, all the way in wherever he was, where he had stood before the Lord beforehand, in his area, quite a ways away from Lot. He can see this destruction from where he's at, and Lot's daughters saw the destruction as well. They know it's very bad, and so they think that there's no one else out there, even though we just saw Abraham. He's running around still. But they see no one else around, no other man, and they try to preserve the human race, so to speak, in, through immorality and terrible things that they did to their father, and their consequences of that. And we see the Moabites, that entire nation, coming from this evil relation, and we also see the Ammonites also coming from this evil relation, and those would also be perennial enemies to the nation of Israel throughout all the time. Read the next books of the Bible. In the Old Testament, you'll see the Ammonites, the Ammonites, you'll see the Moabites. They're running around and making trouble for Israel. So even though we don't see, a specific moral declaration on whether what they did was good or bad, we don't need it because we know that what they did was bad. And we also see the consequences of those bad actions. So yeah, very interesting stuff. Yeah, it's an interesting idea of sulfur. And archaeologists, especially biblical ones, have been looking for areas of where Sodom and Gomorrah might have been located at. And one of the things they look for is the evidence of destruction, this fire and brimstone. So I'll just read a little bit from an archaeology book on evidence of destruction. We'll stop at this chapter. We won't read the next one. But a little bit on some of the evidence that they look for destruction. So across Tal el Hammam, an area of excavation and a possible site of Sodom and Gomorrah, archaeologists found widespread evidence of an intense conflagration that left the Middle Bronze Age city in ruins. They found scorched foundations and floors buried under nearly 3 feet of dark gray ash, as well as dozens of pottery sherds covered with a frothy, melted surface. The glassy appearance indicates that they were briefly exposed to temperatures well in excess of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the approximate heat of volcanic magma. Such evidence suggests the city and its environs were catastrophically destroyed in a sudden and extreme conflagration. So just some interesting things, and it is those evidences of destruction that archaeologists use to try to locate the site of Sodom and Gomorrah. We pretty much narrowed it down to 2 major locations. I won't get into too much more detail. You can look into it yourself. But 2 major locations for those cities, and evidence of destruction is one of the major evidences for finding out where those cities were located at. Because such a catastrophic event as described in the Bible, you would expect to see evidence of such catastrophe. And they believe they've found such evidence in a couple of sites. But yeah, very interesting stuff. All right, any final questions on these 2 chapters, chapter 18 and 19? Yeah, I mean, that gets into a lot of interesting things, especially when we try to look at that with all the details that are mentioned in the story. For instance, when you say that the daughters were influenced by the depravity of the city that they were in, Sodom, we also see, however, that they hadn't beforehand had any relations with a man before, as Lot says and testifies to. So, how does that work out in a depraved town? Perhaps Lot was protecting them. Perhaps, their depravity came on later when they wanted to preserve the human race that they thought had been wiped out completely. But yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah, it's also a very good application as well. Maybe going to a lush big city may not be the best idea. We're also foreshadowed of that very briefly when Lot does pick the area of Sodom to live in. We see right at the beginning that the text says that they were a wicked people, and yet Lot still went over there. And he stayed there for a very long time until he couldn't have stayed there any longer. So yeah, very good stuff. All right, I think we'll end it there, and we've come to Dogman now. So Dogman, could you please close us out with a word of prayer? Amen. So next week we're probably going to hit chapters 20 to maybe 22. We'll see if we can do 3 chapters. And I just want to thank you guys for being here. I know the time difference with the daylight savings can be a little confusing for people, but thank you for sticking around. And I pray that we continue improving these Bible studies and that we can keep having them as well and learn a lot from God's Word too. So thank you all for being here. Hope you have a great week. See you next time. Grace and peace.